This is the story of how, for the first time in nearly a century, the United States government now pays more in interest on its debt than it spends defending the entire country. In fiscal year 2024, net interest on the national debt climbed to $881 billion. National defense came in at $874 billion, and interest won. If you think that is a one-year fluke, stick around, because the 2025 numbers already look worse, and a historian at Stanford argues this is the exact pattern that has taken down every great power in history. Let me walk you through what is actually happening here, because the headlines don't really capture the scale of it. For most of American history, defense ranked as the biggest single line item in the federal budget, covering tanks, ships, missiles, troops, and bases on every continent. That was the price of being a superpower. Interest on the debt always sat there in the background, a manageable cost of doing business that nobody paid much attention to. Look at what happened in just 4 years. Fiscal year 2020 net interest payments came in at $345 billion, and that was it. By 2022, payments hit $476 billion, which set an all-time record at the time. Interest then climbed to $659 billion in 2023, before reaching $881 billion in 2024. The interest bill nearly tripled in 4 years. Two forces stacked on top of each other to make that happen. First, the national debt kept climbing higher. And second, the Federal Reserve hiked interest rates hard starting in March of 2022 to fight inflation that peaked at 8.9% in June of that year. Now the government finds itself rolling old, cheap debt into new, expensive debt, and the average interest rate on all outstanding US debt reached 3.3% in August of 2024, the highest level since 2009. Here is the moment it all broke into the open. On May 10th of 2024, the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget ran the numbers through the first 7 months of fiscal year 2024, and what they found stopped people cold. Net interest sat at $514 billion, national defense at $498 billion, and Medicare at $465 billion. Interest had quietly passed both of them across those same 7 months. Interest spending exceeded everything the federal government spent on veterans' education and transportation put together. Combined, when the full fiscal year wrapped up on the 30th of September of 2024, the result became official, with interest at $881 billion and defense at $874 billion. The Council on Foreign Relations called it exactly what it was: the first time in U.S. history that interest outlays surpassed defense outlays in this way. Here is where the story stops being about accounting and starts being about history. Niall Ferguson, the historian over at Stanford's Hoover Institution, published a paper in 2025 proposing something he calls Ferguson's law. His line is direct, and I'll quote him: "Any great power that spends more on debt servicing than on defense risks, ceasing to be a great power." Ferguson labels the crossover point the Ferguson limit. His argument, backed by historical case studies of Habsburg Spain, Bourbon France, the Ottoman Empire, and the British Empire, runs like this: once a great power crosses that line, the debt burden starts pulling resources away from national security, which leaves the country vulnerable to military challenge from rising rivals. Ferguson states the United States began violating his law, quote, "for the first time in nearly a century in 2024. Getting back on the right side of the line," he adds, is very rare, though not unprecedented. That is the historical frame. Now let's talk about where the numbers head from here, because the trajectory only steepens. Fiscal year 2025 closed on the 30th of September of 2025, and net interest payments, according to the Peterson Foundation, climbed to $970 billion, knocking on the door of $1 trillion. The Government Accountability Office, looking at gross interest that includes what the government pays to its own trust funds, put the total at $1.2 trillion. The national debt itself crossed $38 trillion on the 23rd of October of 2025. By December, the Joint Economic Committee reported the figure at $38.4 trillion, growing at $6.12 billion every single day. Debt as a share of GDP now sits above 122%, which tops the World War II peak of roughly 119%. The Congressional Budget Office now projects that interest will officially cross $1 trillion in fiscal year 2026. By 2035, the annual figure climbs to roughly $1.8 trillion. Across the decade from 2026 to 2035, cumulative net interest payments will total $13.8 trillion, which runs $4.3 trillion higher than what the country is projected to spend on defense over the same stretch. 15.6% of all federal spending will go to interest by 2031, beating the old record set in 1996. By 2035, interest will eat up 22.2% of all federal revenue, almost a quarter of every tax dollar gone before anything else gets paid. The CBO projects that by 2051, interest on the debt becomes the single largest line item in the entire federal budget, bigger than Social Security, bigger than Medicare, and bigger than defense. That is the path we're on. And to be fair, there is a counter-argument you should hear. Former Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen has argued the debt load remains in, quote, a reasonable place if you look at the real inflation-adjusted interest cost rather than the headline number. Her line in 2024 went like this. The way I look at it is that we should be looking at the real interest cost of the debt. That is really what the burden is. Even Yellen has shifted her tone since then. At an American Economic Association panel in January of 2026, she warned, quote, the preconditions for fiscal dominance are clearly strengthening, and she pointed to debt heading toward 150% of GDP across the next 3 decades. Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell has been blunter, repeatedly describing the U.S. fiscal path as unsustainable. There is also a definitional fight worth mentioning here. Analysts at Brown University's Costs of War project argue that total defense-related spending, once you include veterans, intelligence, nuclear weapons at the Department of Energy, and Homeland Security, runs closer to $1.3 trillion. By that broader measure, interest hasn't actually passed defense yet. Since the headline only works using the official budget function, 50 number of $874 billion, then there is the political question, and neither party has put a serious plan on the table to bend this curve. President Trump posted on Truth Social calling for a $1.5 trillion defense budget in fiscal year 2027. The Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget estimated that single proposal would add $5.8 trillion to the debt over a decade, which, of course, means more interest, which means the gap between interest and defense widens even faster. Let's bring this back around. The headline holds up, and if anything, it understates the problem. Fiscal year 2024 marks the year the United States crossed Ferguson S-line for the first time in nearly a century. Interest payments climbed to $970 billion in 2025, and they reprojected to cross $1 trillion in 2026. By 2035, the country sits on track to spend $13.8 trillion just on interest, running $4.3 trillion higher than what it spends defending itself. None of this is a forecast about something that might happen. It already happened. The Treasury already cut the checks. And the only open question now is whether the United States becomes one of the very rare great powers in history to step back across Ferguson's line, or whether it turns into another case study in his next paper. That is where we are. Thanks for watching.